The morning of April 23, 1831, started like any ordinary spring day in Ascension Parish, Louisiana. Thick moisture from the bayou hung in the air, and early light filtered through ancient cypress trees draped with Spanish moss. White Moss Plantation, named for the ghostly look of those very trees, stretched across 3,000 acres of rich delta soil, where row after row of sugarcane disappeared into the morning haze. But before we get into one of the most shocking and disturbing cases in American legal history, if you're watching from Louisiana or anywhere else in the world, drop a comment and let us know where you're from. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this, stories that were buried, hidden, and nearly erased from history, deserve to be remembered and understood. Now, let me bring you back to that fateful morning when everything changed. Before we move forward with this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and type justice in the comments so I know who you are. Thank you, and let's get back to it. Samuel Broussard, the overseer at White Moss Plantation, was making his usual morning rounds when he heard something that sent a chill down his spine. Screaming. Not the ordinary sounds of the plantation coming to life, not the calls of workers heading out to the fields, but something primal and terrifying echoing from the dense woods near the property's eastern edge. He grabbed his rifle and ran toward the sound, his boots splashing through grass wet with dew. Two field hands who had also heard the screams joined him, their faces pale with fear. The screaming lasted maybe 2 minutes, then stopped without warning. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. When they reached the edge of the woods near a clearing where the plantation's livestock pens were kept, they found a scene that would stay with everyone who saw it for the rest of their lives. There was blood, not a small amount, but pools of it soaking into the dark Louisiana soil. Pieces of clothing were scattered across the ground, a torn shirt, a leather vest, fragments of what had once been trousers. There were boots, 5 pairs of them, some still standing upright as if their owners had simply vanished out of them. But there were no bodies. No men. Nothing to explain where 5 grown men could have disappeared to in the span of a few horrible minutes. Samuel Broussard bent down and picked up one of the items from the ground. It was a hat, a wide-brimmed felt hat of the kind worn by slave catchers. He recognized it immediately. It belonged to Cyrus Maddox, one of the most infamous slave catchers operating in the lower Mississippi region. Broussard's hands started to tremble as the realization set in. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the field hands, a man named Joseph who had worked at White Moss for 15 years. "That's Maddox's hat. And that vest, that belonged to Pike Hutchins. They were here. All 5 of them were here." The 5 men Joseph was referring to were well known throughout Louisiana and Mississippi. They were professional slave catchers, men who made their living hunting down escaped slaves and returning them to their owners for reward money. But they were more than just bounty hunters. They were known for their brutality, their cruelty, their willingness to inflict suffering that went far beyond what was necessary for recapture. Cyrus Maddox was the leader, a tall man with a scarred face and cold gray eyes who carried a whip braided from bull hide. Pike Hutchins was his second, a barrel-chested man with massive hands who was rumored to have beaten more than one slave to death during captures. The others were James DeMarco, a Creole tracker known for his skill with hunting dogs, Wesley Thorne, a former soldier who had brought military precision to the ugly business of slave catching, and Thomas Ridley, the youngest of the group but perhaps the most sadistic, known for taking pleasure in inflicting pain. These were dangerous men, feared throughout the region, and now they had vanished, leaving behind only their belongings and an impossible amount of blood. Samuel Broussard organized a search party immediately. Within an hour, 20 men were combing through the woods, following the blood trails, looking for any sign of what had happened. The trails led in different directions, suggesting the men had tried to run, tried to escape from something. But the trails all ended abruptly, as if the men had simply been plucked from the earth. The hog pens were nearby, large enclosures where White Moss Plantation kept nearly 40 hogs, massive animals, some weighing over 300 pounds, bred for meat and lard. The pens were empty when the search party arrived. The gates stood open, and the hogs were gone, scattered into the surrounding woods. One of the searchers found something near the hog pen that made everyone stop. It was a piece of bone, picked clean and showing clear tooth marks, not human tooth marks, but the distinctive crushing marks of a hog's powerful jaws. "Sweet Jesus," Samuel Broussard whispered. "The hogs. The hogs got them." But that raised an impossible question. How could 5 armed, experienced men be killed and consumed by hogs? Hogs were dangerous if provoked, certainly, but 5 grown men with weapons should have been able to defend themselves easily unless they had been trapped somehow. Unless someone had deliberately set the hogs on them. The investigation began immediately. The local sheriff, a portly man named Claude Dubois, arrived at White Moss Plantation by noon with 3 deputies. He interviewed everyone on the property, starting with the overseer and working his way through every slave, every worker, every person who might have seen or heard something. Most people had heard the screaming. Several had seen the 5 slave catchers arrive at the plantation the evening before, riding in just before sunset. They had been looking for a runaway, they said, tracking a slave who had escaped from a plantation 60 miles upriver. They had asked to stay the night to rest their horses and continue the hunt in the morning. The plantation owner, Monsieur Alonze Beaumont, had given them permission to camp on the eastern edge of the property near the livestock pens. It wasn't unusual for slave catchers to pass through, and Beaumont, like most plantation owners, supported their work. Escaped slaves were bad for business, bad for the entire system of control that kept the plantation economy functioning. But someone had known they were there. Someone had waited until deep night when the men were sleeping. Someone had done something that resulted in 5 men being torn apart and devoured by hogs while still alive, judging from the patterns of blood and the evidence of desperate running. It was during the interviews that Sheriff Dubois began to hear a name repeated again and again, always in whispers, always with glances toward one of the slave quarters. Adah Maybelle. The woman who worked in the plantation kitchen. The woman who had served food to the 5 slave catchers the evening before they died. The woman who was known throughout the plantation as the Silent One. Adah Maybelle was 29 years old, though she looked older. Slavery aged people quickly, wearing them down through relentless labor, poor nutrition, and the constant psychological weight of having no control over their own lives. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with dark skin and hands scarred from years of kitchen work. She moved quietly, spoke rarely, and kept her eyes down in the presence of white people, as she had been trained to do from childhood. But everyone on the plantation knew her story, even if they didn't speak of it openly. 2 years earlier, in 1829, Adah had been married to a man named Solomon. They had 2 children together, a boy named Isaac, who was 6 years old, and a girl named Ruth, who was 4. The family lived in one of the slave quarters, a small cabin they shared with 2 other families. And despite the horror of enslavement, they had managed to create small moments of joy, of love, of family connection. Then Solomon had tried to escape. He had been inspired by rumors of freedom in the north, by whispered stories of slaves who had made it to places where they could live as free people. He had planned carefully, saved food, studied the stars for navigation. One night in June 1829, he had kissed his wife and children goodbye and disappeared into the darkness. He had been caught 3 days later by a slave-catching patrol. The patrol had been led by Cyrus Maddox and his crew. They had tracked Solomon using dogs, cornered him near the Yazoo River, 40 miles north of the plantation, and brought him back. But they hadn't brought him back alive. Solomon had fought when they caught him, trying to defend himself, refusing to submit. The slave catchers had beaten him severely. And whether they had intended to kill him, or whether the beating had simply gone too far, the result was the same. Solomon was dead by the time they brought his body back to White Moss Plantation. Monsieur Beaumont had been furious, not because a human being had been killed, but because he had lost valuable property. A healthy male slave in his prime was worth $1,200 or more. The slave catchers had cost him a significant investment. But there was nothing to be done. Solomon had been a runaway, and the law was clear that slave catchers could use whatever force was necessary to recapture escaped slaves. They had hanged Solomon's body from a cypress tree near the river as a warning to other slaves. They had left it there for 3 days before finally allowing it to be cut down and buried. Adah and her children had been forced to look at it every day, a deliberate psychological torture designed to crush any thoughts of resistance or escape. But worse was yet to come. A week after Solomon's death, 6-year-old Isaac had disappeared. The child had simply vanished one morning, and despite searches of the plantation and surrounding areas, he was never found. Some people whispered that he had wandered into the bayou and been taken by an alligator. Others suggested he had tried to run away like his father and had gotten lost in the wilderness. But Adah knew the truth, even if she could never prove it. She had seen Cyrus Maddox and his men on the plantation that day. She had seen the way Thomas Ridley, the youngest of the slave catchers, had looked at her with cold amusement. She had heard him say to one of his companions, "Guess that, __, boy went to find his daddy." And she had understood with horrible certainty that her son had not wandered away. He had been taken, killed, his body disposed of where it would never be found as a final punishment for Solomon's attempted escape. After that, Adah Maybell had changed. The woman who had once sung while she worked, who had smiled at her daughter and found small ways to experience joy despite enslavement, had become silent. She performed her duties in the kitchen with mechanical efficiency. She cared for her remaining daughter with desperate intensity, but she stopped speaking unless absolutely necessary. She stopped making eye contact. She became a ghost moving through the plantation, present but not present, alive but not living. People left her alone. Even the overseer, who was usually quick to punish any slave who seemed insufficiently submissive, left Adah alone. There was something in her silence that was more disturbing than defiance would have been. It was as if she had gone to a place beyond fear, beyond pain, beyond anything that threats or punishment could reach. When Sheriff Du Bois interviewed Adah Maybell on the afternoon of April 23, he found her in the kitchen of the main house, preparing vegetables for the evening meal. She stood at a wooden table, her knife moving with precise, rhythmic strokes, cutting okra into neat slices. She didn't look up when he entered. "Adah," the sheriff said. When she didn't respond, he said more loudly, "Adah Maybell, I need to ask you some questions." She set down her knife and turned to face him. Her expression was completely blank. Her eyes focused somewhere past his left shoulder. She said nothing. "You served food to those 5 men last night," Sheriff Du Bois said. "The slave catchers. You brought them dinner at their camp." "Yes, sir," Adah said quietly. Her voice was barely audible. "What did you serve them?" "Chicken, cornbread, beans, sir. What Mr. Beaumont told me to prepare for them." "Did you talk to them?" "No, sir. I just brought the food and left." "Did you see them again after that?" "Did you go back to their camp?" "No, sir. I went to my quarters and stayed there until morning." Sheriff Du Bois studied her carefully. She showed no signs of nervousness, no indication of lying. But there was something about her complete lack of affect that troubled him. She was too calm. Too empty. "Did you know those men?" he asked. "Had you seen them before?" For the first time, something flickered in Adah's eyes. It was there and gone in an instant, but Sheriff Du Bois saw it, recognition, and something else, something dark and cold that made him take an involuntary step backward. "I've seen them before, sir," Adah said quietly. "They came here 2 years ago. They brought back my husband's body after they killed him. And they took my son." The sheriff felt a chill run down his spine. "Your son ran away?" "My son was 6 years old, sir. He didn't run away. He disappeared the same day those men were here. He was never found." "Are you saying they killed your child?" Adah looked directly at Sheriff Du Bois for the first time. Her eyes were empty of everything except a cold, absolute certainty. "Yes, sir. That's what I'm saying." "Can you prove it?" "No, sir. But I know it. The same way I know the sun rises. The same way I know I'm going to die someday. I know they killed my boy." Sheriff Du Bois shifted uncomfortably. Even if what she was saying was true, there was nothing to be done about it. A slave's testimony couldn't be used against a white person in court. And slave catchers operated with near-total impunity, protected by laws designed to preserve the institution of slavery. "Where were you last night?" he asked. "All night." "Can anyone verify that you stayed in your quarters?" "My daughter Ruth was with me, sir, and 2 other women who share our cabin. We were there all night." The sheriff made notes in his book. He would verify the alibi, but he already suspected it would hold. The other slaves would support whatever story Adah told, partly out of solidarity, partly out of fear of what might happen to them if they didn't. But as he left the kitchen, Sheriff Du Bois couldn't shake the feeling that Adah Maybell knew more than she was saying. There was something in her absolute calm, her complete lack of fear, that suggested a woman who had already decided that nothing worse could happen to her than what she had already endured. Over the next 3 days, the investigation continued. Search parties scoured the woods for any sign of the missing men. They found scattered remains, more bones picked clean by the hogs, some fragments of clothing and personal effects. They recovered pieces of all 5 men, enough to confirm that they were dead, but never enough to make complete bodies. The hogs had been thorough. The question of how it had happened remained unanswered. Could the men have been drunk? There was no evidence of alcohol at their camp. Could they have been drugged? Possibly, but with what? And how? Could someone have set the hogs on them deliberately? But how would one small woman have managed to trap 5 armed men and release 40 hungry hogs without being killed herself? The more Sheriff Du Bois investigated, the more impossible it seemed. And yet, 5 men were dead, torn apart and consumed by hogs in what had to be one of the most horrific deaths imaginable. Someone was responsible. Someone had to pay for this. On April 26, 3 days after the bodies were discovered, Sheriff Du Bois returned to White Moss Plantation with a warrant for Adah Maybell's arrest. He had no concrete evidence linking her to the deaths, but he had enough circumstantial evidence and witness testimony to justify bringing her in for further questioning. And in Louisiana in 1831, the word of a slave meant nothing compared to the suspicions of a white sheriff. When they came for her, Adah was in the kitchen again, working. She showed no surprise when Sheriff Du Bois announced she was under arrest for the murder of 5 men. She simply removed her apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the table. Then she turned to face the deputies who had come to take her. "Can I say goodbye to my daughter?" she asked quietly. Sheriff Du Bois hesitated, then nodded. "Make it quick." Adah walked to the door of the kitchen and called out, "Ruth. Ruth, baby, come here." A small girl, 8 years old, came running from somewhere in the main house where she had been performing chores. She was thin, dressed in a simple shift, her hair in tight braids. When she saw her mother standing with the sheriff and his deputies, her eyes went wide with fear. "Mama." Adah knelt down and pulled her daughter close, holding her tightly. She whispered something in the girl's ear, words the men couldn't hear. The child began to cry, clinging to her mother's neck. Adah held her for a long moment, then gently pulled her daughter's arms away. "You be strong," Adah said, loud enough for the men to hear. "Now you remember what I taught you. You remember who you are. You remember that no matter what they do to your body, they can't touch your soul unless you let them. You understand me?" "Yes, Mama." Ruth sobbed. "I love you, baby. I love you more than anything in this world. Don't you ever forget that." Then Adah stood up, straightened her dress, and looked at Sheriff Du Bois. "I'm ready." They shackled her hands in front of her iron cuffs connected by a short chain and led her to a wagon. Several slaves from the plantation had gathered to watch, their faces showing a mixture of fear, grief, and something else, something that looked almost like grim satisfaction. As the wagon pulled away, Adah turned to look back at the plantation one last time. She saw her daughter standing next to one of the older slave women, being held and comforted. She saw the big house where Monsieur Beaumont lived in comfort, purchased with the suffering of enslaved people. She saw the fields where Solomon had worked until the day he had decided he would rather die than continue living in bondage. And she smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible, but it was there. Sheriff Du Bois, sitting in the wagon beside her, saw it and felt that chill return. There was something wrong here, something he didn't understand. This woman should be terrified. She should be begging, pleading, protesting her innocence. Instead, she sat calmly, her shackled hands folded in her lap, and looked straight ahead as the wagon carried her toward the parish jail in Donaldsonville. She looked like a woman who had already made peace with whatever was coming. She looked like a woman who had nothing left to lose. The jail in Donaldsonville was a small brick building behind the courthouse with 4 cells designed to hold criminals awaiting trial. Adah was placed in one of these cells, a space perhaps 8 feet by 10 feet with a narrow cot, a chamber pot, and a small barred window that let in a little light. The iron door clanged shut behind her, and she was left alone. For the first time since her arrest, Adah allowed herself to feel something other than the numbing emptiness that had sustained her through the past 2 years. She sat on the narrow cot and closed her eyes, and she remembered. She remembered the night she had served dinner to the 5 slave catchers. She had recognized them immediately, even though 2 years had passed. You don't forget the faces of the men who killed your husband and child. She had looked at Cyrus Maddox with his scarred face, at Thomas Ridley with his cold amusement, at the others, and she had felt something crystallize inside her. She had made a decision in that moment. A decision that had been forming for 2 years, growing like a dark flower in the ruins of her life. She had decided that if she was going to die, and she knew that life as an enslaved woman was just a slow death anyway, then she would die having done something that mattered. She would die having taken from them what they had taken from her. After serving the men their dinner, Adah had not gone directly to her quarters as she had told the sheriff. She had gone to the plantation smokehouse, where meat was cured and stored. She had taken a jar of rendered lard that had been treated with arsenic to keep rats away. It was a common practice, lard mixed with poison to bait traps for vermin. The workers knew not to eat it, but anyone unfamiliar with the household's practices might not realize it was contaminated. She had taken that jar of poisoned lard back to the slave catchers' camp. They were sitting around their fire, talking and laughing about past hunts, past captures. She had approached quietly, holding the jar. "Excuse me, sir," she had said, her voice soft and subservient. "I forgot to bring you lard for your breakfast cooking. Mr. Beaumont said to make sure you had supplies for the morning." Cyrus Maddox had barely looked at her. "Just set it down there." She had placed the jar near their supplies and left. She had not mentioned that the lard was poisoned. She had simply left it there and returned to her quarters, where she had sat awake all night, waiting. But that had only been the first part of her plan. She had needed insurance, needed to make sure that even if the poison didn't work, the men would still pay for what they had done. So later that night, while the plantation slept, she had done something that required all her courage, all her hatred, all her desperate need for justice. She had crept back to the area near the hog pens. The 5 men were sleeping in their camp about 50 yards from the pens. She could hear them snoring. She had brought with her a bucket containing food scraps mixed with the remaining poisoned lard. She had fed this mixture to the hogs, who had eagerly consumed it. Arsenic doesn't kill instantly. It causes intense pain, disorientation, and violent illness. She had calculated the dosage carefully, using only enough to make the animals aggressive and maddened with pain, but not enough to kill them outright. Then she had waited. Hidden in the darkness, she had waited for the poison to take effect on both the men and the animals. She had waited for God or fate, or whatever force governed such things, to deliver justice. It had worked better than she had dared hope. The men had woken in the night, writhing in agony from the poison. The hogs, similarly affected, had become violent and agitated. When Adah had opened the gates of the hog pens, the maddened animals had rushed out and they had found the men stumbling around in the darkness, weakened and disoriented. What happened next was something Adah had not stayed to watch. She had heard the screaming, had heard it echo through the night like the screams of the damned. She had heard it and felt nothing except a cold satisfaction. Let them scream. Let them know terror and pain. Let them understand what they had inflicted on others. She had returned to her quarters, washed the dirt from her feet, and climbed into the narrow bed she shared with her daughter. She had held Ruth close and waited for morning. Waited for discovery. Waited for the consequences she knew would come. And now those consequences had arrived. She was in jail awaiting trial for murder. She would be convicted, there was no doubt about that. A slave accused of killing white men would never receive anything resembling justice. She would be found guilty and executed, probably hanged, possibly burned alive if they wanted to make an example of her. But Adah found that she didn't care. She had done what she needed to do. She had given those 5 men a death as terrifying and painful as the deaths they had inflicted on countless others. She had struck a blow, however small, against the system that had destroyed her family and destroyed her life. She had no regrets. If anything, she felt lighter than she had in 2 years, as if a great weight had been lifted from her chest. The debt had been paid. The scales had been balanced, if only for a moment. Days passed in the jail cell. Adah was fed basic rations: cornmeal, a little salt pork, water. She was allowed no visitors, no contact with anyone from the plantation. Sheriff Du Bois came once to question her further, but she told him nothing beyond what she had said before. She sat in her cell, stared at the small barred window, and waited. On May 3rd, 10 days after her arrest, Sheriff Du Bois returned with news. "You're being transferred to New Orleans for trial," he said. "The parish judge has decided this case is too significant to be handled locally. You'll be tried in the Orleans Parish Criminal Court." Adah nodded, showing no emotion. New Orleans. She had never been to the city, had never traveled more than a few miles from the plantation where she had been born. Now she would see it as a prisoner being transported to face justice for killing white men. The journey to New Orleans took 2 days. Adah was placed in a closed wagon with 2 guards, her hands and feet shackled, treated like a dangerous criminal. They traveled along rough roads that paralleled the Mississippi River, passing through small towns and vast stretches of plantation land where thousands of enslaved people worked in the fields. At night, they stopped at roadside inns, but Adah was not allowed inside. She slept in the wagon, still shackled, given only a blanket to ward off the spring chill. The guards ate hot meals while she was given cold cornbread and water. She endured it all without complaint, without resistance. She was beyond caring about physical discomfort. Her body was just a vessel now, something to be disposed of once it had served its purpose. That purpose had already been fulfilled on the night she had fed 5 men to her hogs. They arrived in New Orleans on the evening of May 5th. The city was enormous, overwhelming, filled with more people than Adah had ever seen in her life. The streets bustled with activity: merchants, sailors, free people of color, enslaved people running errands for their owners, white people of all social classes going about their business. The wagon took her directly to the Orleans Parish Prison, a grim stone building that held criminals of all kinds. She was processed by guards who looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. A slave who had killed white men. It was almost unheard of. Most slaves who killed their masters did so in moments of sudden rage or desperation. Few planned murders, and fewer still succeeded in killing multiple people. Adah was placed in a cell in the women's section of the prison. It was similar to the one in Donaldsonville, small, dark, with a narrow cot and a chamber pot. But here she could hear other prisoners, their voices echoing through the stone corridors. Women crying, women singing, women calling out to guards or to each other. She lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling. Her trial would come soon. She would be convicted. She would be executed. It was all inevitable as the sunrise. But first, she would have her moment. First, she would stand in a courtroom and speak her truth. They could kill her body, but they couldn't stop her from bearing witness to what had been done to her, what had been done to her family, what was being done every day to enslaved people across the South. She would speak, and people would hear. And maybe someday, when this whole evil system finally collapsed under the weight of its own cruelty, maybe someone would remember her words. Maybe someone would understand that justice sometimes wears a different face than the law recognizes. As Adah lay in her cell in New Orleans, waiting for her trial to begin, she thought about her daughter Ruth. The girl was only 8 years old, growing up enslaved, facing a life of suffering and exploitation. Adah had failed to save Isaac. She had failed to save Solomon. But maybe, in some small way, her actions would matter. Maybe her willingness to strike back, to refuse to accept injustice passively, would inspire others. Maybe Ruth would grow up hearing the story of her mother who had fought back, and it would give her strength. Or maybe not. Maybe Adah's death would be meaningless, just one more tragedy in a system built on tragedy. Maybe nothing would change, and Ruth would suffer the same fate as her mother, and the cycle would continue forever. But at least Adah had tried. At least she had refused to die quietly. At least she had made 5 evil men pay for their evil deeds, even if only for a moment before they dragged her down with them. The trial was set for May 15, 1831. 10 days to wait. 10 days to prepare for the final act of her life. 10 days before she would speak the words that would shock a courtroom, a city, and eventually a nation. Adah Maybell closed her eyes and tried to rest. She would need her strength for what was coming. She would need to be strong enough to stand before her judges and speak her truth without fear, without apology, without regret. And she would be. She had survived slavery. She had survived the loss of her husband and son. She had survived the aftermath of feeding 5 men to hogs. She could survive this last test. She could do this one final thing before they took her life. She could speak. The Orleans Parish Criminal Court was housed in the Cabildo, a Spanish colonial building on Jackson Square that served as the seat of municipal government. On the morning of May 15, 1831, a crowd began gathering outside the courthouse before dawn. Word had spread throughout New Orleans about the case, a slave woman accused of murdering 5 white men by feeding them to hogs. It was sensational, horrifying, and irresistible to a public hungry for shocking news. By the time the courthouse doors opened at 8 o'clock, more than 300 people were waiting to get inside. The courtroom could accommodate perhaps 150 spectators, which meant that hundreds would be turned away. Fights broke out among those trying to secure seats. Sheriff's deputies had to form a line to control the crowd. Inside the courtroom, preparations were underway for what promised to be one of the most talked-about trials in Louisiana history. Judge Armand Desland, a stern man in his 60s who had served on the bench for 20 years, reviewed the case documents at his desk. He was known as a fair but strict jurist, someone who followed the letter of the law without sentiment or mercy. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Claude Morange, an ambitious lawyer in his 40s who saw this case as an opportunity to advance his political career. He had built his reputation prosecuting criminals, and a successful conviction in such a high-profile case would cement his standing among the wealthy plantation owners who controlled Louisiana politics. There was no defense attorney. Under Louisiana law, slaves were not entitled to legal representation. They could speak in their own defense, but they had no right to counsel, no right to call witnesses on their behalf, no right to any of the protections afforded to white defendants. The trial would be a formality, really a public demonstration of justice being served before the inevitable conviction and execution. At 9 o'clock, Adah Maybell was brought into the courtroom through a side door. She was still wearing the simple gray dress she had been arrested in, now dirty and wrinkled from days in jail. Her hands were shackled in front of her, connected by a chain to shackles on her ankles, forcing her to take small, shuffling steps. 2 guards flanked her, gripping her arms as if she might try to run, though where a small, shackled woman could run to in a courtroom surrounded by armed men was unclear. The crowd reacted to her appearance with a mixture of gasps, whispers, and a few shouted insults. "Murderer," someone yelled from the back. "Hang her," shouted another voice. Judge Desland banged his gavel sharply. "Order. I will have order in this court, or I will clear the room. Anyone who disrupts these proceedings again will be removed and held in contempt." The noise subsided to whispers. Adah was led to a small wooden chair in front of the judge's bench. She sat down carefully, her chains rattling, and for the first time looked around the courtroom. She saw faces staring at her with hatred, with curiosity, with fascination. She saw wealthy plantation owners in fine clothes sitting in the front rows. She saw merchants and professionals, journalists with notebooks ready to record every detail, even a few free people of color who had been allowed into the back of the room. What she did not see was a single friendly face, a single person who looked at her with sympathy or understanding. She was completely alone, surrounded by people who had already decided she was guilty, who had come only to witness her condemnation. Judge Desland called the court to order and read the charges. The accused, a slave woman known as Adah Maybell, property of Monsieur Alonze Beaumont of White Moss Plantation in Ascension Parish, stands charged with 5 counts of murder in the deaths of Cyrus Maddox, Pike Hutchkins, James DeMarco, Wesley Thorne, and Thomas Ridley, all free white men and licensed slave catchers operating under the authority of Louisiana law. He paused, looking down at Adah. "How do you plead to these charges?" Adah met his gaze steadily. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Guilty, sir." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Even though everyone had expected a guilty verdict, hearing the defendant confess immediately was unexpected. Judge Desland frowned. "You understand what you're saying? You confess to murdering 5 men?" Yes, sir. I killed them. I planned it, and I did it, and I don't deny it. The murmur grew louder. District Attorney Morange stood up, looking slightly annoyed. He had prepared an elaborate prosecution with witnesses, evidence, and dramatic presentations, and now the defendant was simply confessing, potentially robbing him of his moment in the spotlight. Your Honor, Morange said, while the accused has confessed, I believe it's important for the court and the public to understand the full details of these heinous crimes. I request permission to present evidence and witness testimony. Judge Desland nodded. Granted. Proceed, Mr. Morange. What followed was 3 hours of testimony designed to paint Adah Maybell as a monster. Sheriff Dubois testified about finding the remains of the 5 men, describing the scene in graphic detail. He showed the court items recovered from the site, the blood-stained clothing, the boots, the bones that had been picked clean. He described the hog pen with its open gates, the trails of blood leading in different directions, the evidence that the men had tried desperately to escape but had been overwhelmed. Samuel Broussard, the overseer from White Moss Plantation, testified about Adah's behavior in the days before the murders. He described how she had served food to the slave catchers, how she had appeared calm and subservient, giving no indication of her intentions. He testified that Adah was known as a quiet, obedient worker who had never shown signs of violence or rebellion before this incident. Dr. Henri Gauthier, a physician who had examined the remains, testified about the cause of death. The men were attacked by hogs while still alive, he said. The pattern of injuries, the evidence of defensive wounds, the nature of the bone damage, all of this indicates they were conscious and fighting for their lives when the animals attacked them. It would have been an extremely painful, terrifying way to die. District Attorney Morange made sure to emphasize this point. So these men suffered greatly before they died? Yes, Dr. Gauthier confirmed. They would have been in agony. Hogs are powerful animals with crushing jaw strength. Being attacked by multiple animals simultaneously would have resulted in catastrophic trauma. Death probably took several minutes, during which the victims would have been fully aware of what was happening to them. The courtroom audience listened with rapt attention, many looking horrified, others appearing grimly satisfied. This was the kind of sensational detail they had come to hear. Morange then called several slaves from White Moss Plantation to testify. They were brought in one by one, clearly terrified of being in a courtroom, aware that anything they said could result in punishment later. They testified reluctantly about Adah's history, her husband's escape attempt and death, the disappearance of her son, her subsequent withdrawal into silence. One of these witnesses was a woman named Esther, who had shared a cabin with Adah. She changed after they killed Solomon, Esther testified, her voice barely audible. She stopped talking, stopped singing. She was like a ghost, just going through the motions of living, but not really alive anymore. Did she ever express hatred toward the slave catchers who killed her husband? Morange asked. Esther hesitated, then nodded. Once. About a month after Solomon died, I heard her say, "They took everything from me. Someday they'll pay." But that was all. She never talked about it again. This testimony established premeditation, which Morange emphasized heavily. This was not a crime of passion, he told the court. This was cold, calculated revenge. The accused spent 2 years planning these murders, waiting for an opportunity, and when it came, she struck without mercy or hesitation. He produced the jar of poisoned lard that had been found at the slave catchers' camp. Chemical analysis had confirmed the presence of arsenic. He called a witness from the plantation who testified that lard treated with arsenic was kept in the smokehouse for rat poison, and that Adah would have had access to it. The accused poisoned both the men and the hogs.